Have you hosted a Fat Tire Amber over the holidays? Ever wonder about who made it? Well, that tasty beer was produced by a 100% worker-owned brewery in Colorado. What does a worker-owned business mean in terms of wages, scheduling, use of profits, and, in a broader sense, corporate power and democracy? And joining us to talk about worker cooperatives is Cooperation DC organizer Allison Basile. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, David. Great to be here.
Really appreciate it. And it occurs to me, we've got some technical problems here. 1 second. Going to need you to speak up, Allison, having little technical difficulties on this side. It occurs to me as I was writing that intro that Fat Tire Beer Brewery in Colorado, they actually might not be technically a cooperative. Am I correct with that? Do you happen to know?
I don't know about Flat Tire. I know there are a few worker-owned breweries. New Belgium is another one. There's a spectrum of worker ownership. So right. Some of those may be ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans.
Right, so that's a little bit different than a cooperative.
Exactly. So on one end of that spectrum, worker co-ops, the workers both own in terms of the economics, but also manage the business. And in ESOPs, it could be as little as 5% worker ownership, up to 100%.
Fat Tire is a part of New Belgium.
Okay.
And you say that is the EIN or
ESOP?
Oh, ESOP. Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
At any rate, let's. I picked it because it's one business that a lot of people might be aware of. I mean, they're pretty.
All the beer drinkers out there.
I think they're like one of the largest of that genre of beer, and I think they're 8th in the country, something like that. Anyway. So let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly is a worker cooperative? How do you describe it?
So a worker cooperative is a business that's owned and managed by its workers. So profits, rather than going to a few investors and owners, go to all of the workers in an equitable way, usually according to how many hours each worker has worked. Mm-hmm. And then in addition, the key decisions in the business are made on a one worker, one vote basis.
Mm-hmm. They aren't necessarily made day to day. You turned me on to a video that was talking about vertical orientation when you're out in the field, but horizontal when you're back in the offices. If you could maybe talk about that distinction. Yeah,
so there are a lot of different ways worker co-ops can be set up. They can be as small as 3 workers and as big as, several thousand. So as they get bigger, there are often different hierarchical structures within them. They're just more accountable. So workers are still voting on the board of directors that's hiring a manager. And then there are other, depending on the co-op, key decisions that workers weigh in on. But there's sort of a difference. There's a spectrum of democratic participation in different worker co-ops.
Right, but in general, you can say that it's worker controlling the means of production, I guess, to put it in Marxist terms.
Yep, for sure.
Right, which is prompts the next question. I mean, why is it important to promote them? And I guess that would be key. There's a sense of ownership and involvement that you don't have otherwise when you're merely an employee.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we know we have a horrible jobs crisis, but an even more severe ownership or wealth crisis. With the richest 400 Americans owning more than the bottom 180 million, and that dynamic in D.C. is magnified, since we're one of the large cities with one of the widest wealth gaps in the whole country. So worker co-ops are really about changing that dynamic, and especially giving people who've been most marginalized from our current economy the opportunity to build wealth and really for self-determination.
And you are particularly in your efforts and maybe in the whole movement, there's a particular effort to empowering people of color and people in poverty. If you could talk about that.
Yeah. So with Cooperation DC in particular, we're housed as a project of One DC, one of DC's organizing groups, Organizing Neighborhood Equity DC, which has the mission to create and preserve racial and economic equity in the district. And so, by being housed in One DC, we really take that lens of, worker co-ops can be for anyone of any race or class, but we're particularly interested in kind of being a counter force to the prevailing kind of racist and classist economy. So we are focused. One of our biggest priorities this year is incubating a worker cooperative of returning citizens, a laboring co-op called Tight Shift Laboring Cooperative that provides painting, cleaning, moving, landscaping, and other services. So that's the approach we're taking.
Just 1 second, Allison. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties here.
Well, Allison, let me ask you a question if I can. This is Eugene,
Hey, Eugene.
Puryear. Good to hear from you as always. And how are, looking at these issues of co-ops, I think one thing people might say is, well, is this really financially sustainable? Are banks going to invest in this? Is the city going to invest in this? Is it possible to really get to scale with co-ops so it's not just a handful of things here and there with a bunch of people, but that a real sector of the economy could emerge?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think when we look at co-ops around the world, in the U.S. we have only about 400 right now, so we have a lot of work to do in building our worker co-op industry. But in Spain, Italy, Canada, several countries in Latin America, they're really vibrant worker co-ops, and it's a big portion of the economy there. So just to give an example, in one region in Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, about 10% of all workers, about 40% of the GDP are created by worker cooperatives. And so we look at some of the ways that they've grown to scale. One example is all co-ops have a tax. 3% of profits or co-op surplus goes into supporting the development of new worker co-ops.
And this is in Romagna in Italy now?
Yep.
Okay.
And so we're starting to see the Valley Alliance of worker cooperatives in the northeast of the U.S. is starting to build a regional network of cooperatives where there's a similar kind of payment that goes into new cooperative development. And that's what we have to do to build up and scale and go beyond kind of smaller businesses into larger swaths of the economy.
Can you describe what you mean by building to scale? What exactly does that mean?
Building to scale. So I think we want to be 400 worker co-ops in the whole country is a great start, but really barely a blip as compared to other engines in our economy. And so we want to looking at Emilia-Romagna and 10 to 20% of workers. That's where we want to get to, and even beyond that, we want to see the whole.
Tell folks who that reference. Who are you talking about?
Oh, Emilia-Romagna is a region in Italy.
And talk about that. I think most people aren't familiar with that.
Sure. So it's there are worker co-ops in all different industries, but the kind of the notable thing is how dense they are. So when we say scale, the ultimate vision is that all businesses are owned by their workers, because we think that that's how it should be. People should profit from their own labor. But so there's going to be different steps to getting there, particularly here in DC, where capitalism is quite entrenched.
Well, that district too in Italy, an old stronghold of the Italian communist movement.
Right.
Just kind of stay on theme there, since you dropped a little means of
I
production
remember
earlier.
being there back in my long lost youth and going to a communist picnic with a tablecloth with the hammer and the sickle, and it was probably those same people. It was in northern Italy. It's probably the same people that were organizing. But going to scale isn't just a question of the percentage of companies within a particular area that are cooperatives. It also it's a term that's used to describe within the actual individual business. Correct?
Yeah. So each business being able to provide income opportunities for a large number of people. And we're also interested in kind of deep democracy and worker cooperatives. So to take an example, credit unions are member-owned banks, so they're cooperative banks. But there's a range of democratic practices, some that look pretty much like regular banks that are really trying to stymie democracy, not really have open board elections, but some that are really meaningfully democratic. And so the same goes with worker co-ops. We're interested in not just the number of workers and the percent of the economy, but also how truly democratic they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Talk about, if you would, what kind of counterbalance this represents to corporate power in this country. I mean, as you say, it's minuscule. Cooperatives, worker cooperatives are minuscule right now. What, 1% of GDP, something like that, I would imagine. I mean, very, very small. I mean, are there any in D.C. right now?
In D.C., we have Brighter Days Dog Walking Collective, which is one of the very few worker co-ops in D.C. We also have several exciting startups, though. Zenful Bites is a healthy food catering company. Community Farming Alliance is looking to structure as a worker co-op, but they are a farming alliance of farmers of color and women that includes several members and are looking to grow, and then Tight Shift Labor and Cooperative and a few others. Mm-hmm. So I would say we're far from being a counterforce to capitalism, both in D.C. and in the country. One of the things that the national movement is looking at in terms of scale is the businesses where the owner is retiring in the coming years and looking at transitioning to worker ownership as a viable kind of exit strategy. Mm-hmm. It's one that many owners don't know about, but once they do, there's financiers, lawyers in place to help make that transition happen, and it's a really good way to keep businesses open.
So it's just really starting up here in D.C., but there are bastions of worker cooperatives, relatively speaking. In New York and San Francisco, Oakland, Madison, Wisconsin, I believe has a cab company that's a cooperative.
Exactly. Yep. You named the regions that have the densest networks. And another thing I'll say about in terms of being a viable counterforce, one of the things we're thinking a lot about in D.C. is not just building worker co-ops in and of themselves and kind of stopping there, but co-ops involve a lot of training and education, and so we're also, as being a part of One DC, thinking about baking in the political education as well, and thinking about ourselves as agents of change and organizers within many social justice movements in D.C. and beyond. So we think that's one way that even if, as the numbers stay relatively smaller compared to the whole economy right now, how we can use our voice to kind of make a bigger point.
Right. And this is not utopia. It's certainly not instant utopia. I mean, you don't necessarily get wonderful wages right at the top just because you have a worker cooperative, right? I mean, if you could talk about that. It can be something that takes several years to develop. There's a lot of expertise and learning going on.
Absolutely. I mean, worker co-ops are businesses, operating in a capitalist economy.
Right.
But because of their values and their ownership structure, we just, studies have shown that they do pay better, they provide better benefits, and just more workplace dignity in general. But in New York City, there are some, worker co-ops that saw wages increase from $10 to $25 an hour within the first few years. So it really can be quite a notable difference.
Uh-huh. So how specifically are you looking at developing the worker cooperatives in D.C.? What's your strategy?
So we're looking to do a few things. Focus on kind of really going deep, which we think will give us the best chance of growing to scale, to over 100 workers in the next few years, with tight shift labor and cooperative. And then also continuing to provide trainings, so legal training, finance trainings, building our partnership with the Working World, which is a cooperative financer based in New York City, but building regional networks around the country, and also does some work in Latin America. And also starting to have conversations with funders and government stakeholders so that we can begin to build the ecosystem in that way as well. And it's similar to what's happening in other cities with more developed worker co-op sectors. So those are a few of the things that we're focusing on in the coming years.
So if you're a group of workers, you're thinking a cooperative might be of interest. It's not necessarily going to be that easy to get funding, particularly here in D.C. I mean, banks are not, I imagine, predisposed to making loans, startup monies to worker cooperatives. You talk about this Working World, but are there other financial resources? I noticed in New York City there's a church-based Presbyterian Protestant organization that's particularly supportive of worker cooperatives. Is there anything like that on the horizon here in D.C.?
So with funding worker cooperatives, there are, in addition to the Working World, a few other just specifically cooperative loan funds. So that's really helpful, and especially in these early stages when we're really focused on a few. It's a lot. It's a lot. We have a lot of work to do in getting other banks and credit unions on board, but there's a strong national sort of support infrastructure for worker co-ops. Mm-hmm. So that combined with, in some cases there will be foundation funding, foundations that want to support, say, returning citizens, and may not share all of the same political analyses as we do, but there's still an overlap in terms of what they'll support. And then there's also some kind of direct public offering and other kind of variations of crowdfunding that are emerging around the country to support worker cooperatives. So we're very far from having no access to financing, even though there's still a ways to go in developing new sources.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think perhaps you have a unique opportunity here. The new chair of the Workforce Investment Council in Washington, D.C., Mr. Andy Shalal, Busboys and Poets, big supporter of WPFW, which you listeners could be too. Go to WPFWFM.org, become a member, make a donation. So here's a good chance he could be listening to this right now. So going into the budget season, where there's going to be a lot of proposals about what to be doing around jobs, what would be your one message to the Workforce Investment Council about what they could do to boost co-ops as a means of employing people in hard-to-employ populations?
We have the Cooperation DC has several ways that we've looked at in talking to people from cities around the country that have public support for worker co-ops. That's everything from grants, loans, technical assistance, so incorporating it in their small business development centers. And then particularly as we get more worker co-ops off the ground, looking at procurement preference for worker co-ops. So there's a lot that can be done, and some things are better to be done sooner than later. But in particular, in the coming years, funding for pilots, particularly this pilot worker cooperative for returning citizens, in an industry that's strong and growing in DC, would be a really good use of relatively few public funds, showing what's possible and that good jobs can be created by and for returning citizens.
I would imagine the naysayer listening to this would say, hey, this is not New York. You have a mayor in New York who's quite supportive of worker cooperatives, at least verbally anyway, from what I've seen. But Muriel Bowser, our mayor, I would not think would be particularly excited about it. I mean, she takes a a lot of money from developers, as we all know, et cetera, whatever the name of the PAC was, the now deceased PAC. Do you feel like you have some serious allies actually on the council? We've got Andy Shalal, of course, who I should say, is not running around actually creating worker cooperative models in his restaurant conglomerate, but obviously politically much more progressive than the average entrepreneur. But who on the council in the mayor's office do you see as being supportive of this, or at least open to it? I imagine David Grasso, Alyssa,
Silverman.
Who else do you think?
Yeah, so we had a briefing kind of in partnership with some of the national worker co-op experts at the Democracy at Work Institute in November, and we had reps from Councilmember Bond, Silverman, and Allen's office come and learn about worker co-ops as a important, equitable economic development strategy, and they were really interested. And we think other council members, Grasso, McDuffie, would be really interested as well. And so those are conversations we're going to continue to have. And we'll just have to see with the mayor. Mayor Bowser has said that equity is important to her. We know the track record doesn't quite show that, but this is... When
you say equity is important to her, what exactly do you mean?
Well, those are just words I've heard her say. But I share your view that that's not actually what's happening in practice. But I would say, unlike something like truly funding affordable housing for everyone, which is also absolutely necessary in D.C., the worker co-op movement needs relatively less money. So something like $200,000 can make a really big splash in developing worker co-ops. Whereas with affordable housing, we need somewhere around the $3 billion range, which we're going to continue to fight for. But so, the council, the mayor, having projects that can be talked about and cited as wins, even if they're relatively small scale and not systemic. That's sort of the bread and butter of what's funded. So we think that there's actually a good chance that there's going to be support for this work.
Right, because it's a paradigm shift where you're talking about getting away from the idea of economic development by bringing in 5 Walmarts, right? You're talking about a very, very different paradigm that's going to take. It's a long haul. I think it's very exciting, but it's going to be a long haul. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
Well, what I will say, Dave, is that perhaps one way to convince people, you mentioned Zinful Bites. I hate to do this, but I've had their food. It's really good. And I feel like a lot of people are just thinking is this like a real thing, like co-ops? Is it like a real business? But I think seeing it in practice is what's going to start to win people over.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the examples you gave, Dave, there are other companies kind of on the scale and size of Walmart, Winco, Publix, other kind of big box stores that are worker owned. Even Costco pays its employees much better. So even though it feels like a far stretch in a city that's very supportive of several Walmarts coming, it's really just a matter of matching public opinion and sentiment with our political realities, which involves organizing.
Right.
So I think we're actually not quite as far as it can sometimes feel. It's just a matter of really, demanding that these already existing, pretty simple solutions be used rather than kind of traditional Walmart strategies.
Indeed. No, I didn't mean to say it's impossible at all. I think it's very exciting, actually. I just that I think it's, we're talking about a long-range perspective, and people shouldn't be discouraged if it doesn't happen tomorrow or the day after. Where can people get more information on your work?
So you can keep in touch getting on the 1DC listserv. 1DC Online is that website. We'll have our Cooperation DC website up shortly, but that interim website is coopdc.org, where there's a lot of additional resources. And then you can reach us at dcworkercoops@gmail.com, or give us a call, 443-562-5856.
Wonderful. I really appreciate your time and exciting project that you're involved with. Been speaking with Corporation DC organizer Allison Basile. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you both so much.
Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
And when we come back, the state of youth criminal justice in DC. Don't go away.